Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
About 100 years ago, one of the greatest miracles took place in Fatima, Portugal. Welcome to PolyPat Session 3.
Hey, man, Eric, it's always a pleasure to have these conversations. I'm thinking, can we come up with another name? Well, I kind of like PolyPat. Maybe we'll let the listeners decide.
Yeah, it's just a cool combination and alliteration thing.
It's definitely growing on me. I enjoy it. So welcome back, everybody, to the collaborative effort between Eric and myself. If you're listening on my show, this will be part of Sunday School. And then if you're listening on Eric's, I think this is just part of your regular programming now. And we want to talk about miracles, and specifically one very big and important miracle within the Catholic faith today. But I think this will be interesting to anybody who has any interest in miracles at all, because this was something I was totally unfamiliar with, certainly before I became Catholic. And then when I first heard about this, the miracle of the sun, I was interested. And I have to admit, I have a great deal of ignorance on the subject. It's not been an area of research or specialization for me. So I'm going to come in here very much as a student. But I understand the general sketch. And the general sketch, it seems to me very convincing that this really not only did occur, but was what the vast majority of people seem to have reported as well. So we have a special guest with us today. I'd like to introduce him now. He is an expert on this. He's done a tremendous amount of research on the miracle of the sun. He has a book out, in fact. So, Kevin, welcome to the podcast, Kevin Symonds.
All right. Thank you guys for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
So before we dive in, Kevin, can you just give us a little relevant background info? Who are you? How'd you get to be doing all the stuff that you're currently researching and writing about?
Sure. Well, I'm originally from Massachusetts, and I'm now in Michigan. I grew up there in Massachusetts, just outside of Boston, a little city called Malden, and not to be confused with Walden, as in like Henry David Thoreau.
Right.
What started college? Well, I should probably back up. I grew up in really in a family that didn't have much to do with religion. My father came up from a Catholic background. My mother was a Unitarian background, and I remember going to church in the Unitarian community there for, I think, maybe 2 times, and then that was basically the extent of whatever we did. Mm-hmm. And then in 1994, my father fell down a flight of stairs, and it led to a lot of medical issues. And his extended relatives, who were very strong Polish Catholics, came into back again in his life a little bit more, and visiting more often, that kind of thing. And they were very open about sharing the faith with me. So I was actually very interested. So I paid attention to what they were telling me. I started reading, getting materials, talking to them as well as other people. And eventually, long story short, in 1997, March of that year, I became Catholic. So here we are now, almost 23 years later. In 1999, I started college, first up in Maine, and then I transferred out to Franciscan University of Steubenville, Ohio, where I was studying theology, graduated in 2003 with my bachelor's in theology, and then 2006 with the master's also in theology. I also had a background in my undergraduate years in the classical languages of Greek and Latin, and in high school I had taken French. So because of that language background, I was able to do a little bit more in theology, because it's very difficult to do theology if you don't have a language background. Right. There's just such a plethora of writings that if you don't know the language, or at least have a functioning knowledge of it, you kind of impoverish yourself.
Sure.
So, and my interest in theology, generally speaking, largely arose from my becoming Catholic and studying. And I had also gotten involved in internet apologetics way back in the day when AOL was, America Online, that is, was very popular. Stuff.
I remember the days, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's still around, and my mother still uses it, but, I don't mean to be rude, AOL, sorry, but it's going the way of the dodo. And I'm long since divorced from it, but for the vast majority anyway. So, not to say the program's bad. I'm not trying to strike AOL. Just be clear about that. So it kind of grew out of that, especially talking to Protestants online and just kind of getting involved in. I've always had an eye for all things mystical, and this is one of the aspects of my background that I don't really talk about as much. But had I not have become Catholic, there would have been some interesting things that I more than likely would have gotten involved in.
Right.
So I'll just keep it simple and say that some of that mystical background is what plays into my present interests with all things church's theology of private revelation, in a healthy way, of course. I'm just to be clear about that. And my studies in theology really helped me to refine that interest a little bit more and have a deeper understanding of what I was actually searching for in looking for these sorts of things.
Okay, yeah, that's really good. That's very interesting. I actually didn't know your full background, so now I'm thinking of like a million different questions I want to ask you. But I know you're on a time limit, so we'll stay focused. You mentioned private revelation. I think this is worth spending a few minutes on because I think this is something that's we need to have clarity on, especially from a Catholic perspective before we move forward. So what is the Catholic position on private revelation? And well, maybe, start with what it is and then what the church's position is on it.
Okay. Well, the church understands, she has a whole theology of what she calls revelation. That is the God self-disclosure. And she divides it principally into two parts, what we call public and then private revelation. It's still the same God who is above all, above the two, but there's a technical distinction between them. So public revelation encompasses what we call in Catholic theology Scripture and tradition, the sacred Scriptures and the apostolic tradition, that is. And that is what our faith is founded upon, is the revelation of God in salvation history, which concluded with the death of the last apostle, roughly around 100 AD or so, according to tradition, which long held to believe to be St. John the Apostle.
Right.
And then the church makes a further distinction and says, well, God doesn't cease talking to people, to his people throughout the course of Christian history, but he doesn't reveal anything new for our salvation. Mm-hmm. It's always a return back to what he has revealed about himself already. He spoke everything in the person of his Son, Jesus Christ, the Word.
Right.
So everything that happens after the death of the last apostle points us back to that. And so the church in her theology has made a distinction between public revelation, which all Catholics are required to believe, versus private revelation, which is a help to that public revelation, but not mandatory under pain of sin for us to believe.
Right. And I think, this is important, that the public revelation, would it be fair to say that that's sort of the standard which all claims of private revelation must be measured against?
Yes.
Because, and this is kind of the part that I'm getting at, and I can understand people wanting to be prudent about this, because the church doesn't affirm all private revelations. Does she, Kevin? Right. So help us there, right? Because there's been obviously many claims of private revelation that as Catholics, and I think as even many Christians generally would say, no, that isn't from the good team right there, right? Like this might be the term preternatural revelation is sometimes used. So what's your advice there for people in the discerning process? I mean, obviously we have the church who can come in and sort of put the seal of approval or condemn something. But I think this is worth spending a few minutes on because there's obviously many claims of private revelation throughout the centuries, and people want some clarity. We want to know, like, what can we accept, what can't we accept. Mm-hmm. Help us out, Kevin, if you don't mind.
Well, I always take it back to what St. John wrote in his first letter, that we have to test the spirits. That's kind of the foundational principle here. Well, the question is, how do you test the spirits? Mm-hmm. Some people have the charism of the discernment of spirits. So, for instance, in Acts chapter 16, I believe, you see the story of the demoniac woman who was going around following St. Paul, saying, "These men speak for God. They speak for God. What they say is true. What is true." After a few days of this, St. Paul gets sick of it and turned around and exorcised the demon and ran out of her. Well, did she say anything wrong? These men come from God. They're speaking the truth. And yet Paul said, nope, you got a demon of divination, and you boom, and exorcised her on the spot. How did he know that? Well, he had the charism of the discernment of spirits. So sometimes the evil spirits will lie, the demons will lie, and they will say things that are true in order to gain our trust.
Right.
Very careful about that. So for instance, in this case, when Paul left that locality, people might have remembered what she had said and maybe thought, well, maybe what she was saying, she was speaking the truth before, and then just kind of rope you in. It's that little bit of information that kind of sucks you in the hook, if you will. And then next thing you know, boom, you get yanked if you're not careful.
Yeah.
So you have to be very, very careful. So there's the charism of the discernment of spirits. And then for the rest of us lesser mortals like myself that do not have that charism, there are things that we can look for, little telltale signs. And I think when we follow the great masters of spiritual theology, particularly mystical theology, of St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross, they lay this out very, very clearly. And St. Teresa is very, very clear. She says, it is not the one who has the most visions that proves their holiness. She said, it's the one she who is most virtuous. Remember, she's a nun speaking about but she's the feminine pronoun there. It's the one who is the most virtuous, the one who is most humble. So, for instance, if you have a religious sister or even a lay sister or man that's boasting of these revelations, no, it's not a good sign. There's a famous story that involves St. Philip Neri, for instance. It's not involving a private revelation, but it gives you a similar sense. He heard about a woman that was local there in Rome, I think it was, and for being holy. And he went on her convent door one day and knocked on it. He said, "Hi, I'm here to see the saint." And she goes, and it happened to be that woman in question. She answered the door, and she said, "I am she." And he goes, "No, you are not." He turned around and walked away. So it's just that simple, So some people, but again, it is a simple principle, but at the same time, it can also get very complicated because you have some really, really good con artists out there. Really, really good con artists.
Right.
That know how to put on the airs of holiness. But in fact, when you do a little bit of digging, I'll give you an example. I won't mention names because I know for a fact that I will be sued if I do.
Yeah, not the podcast. Send a suit right to Kevin.
I've been duly warned by legal counsel on this case, on this particular case in general. But for instance, there was a case that involved an alleged mystic that I'm familiar with, and some people that know this mystic made some very serious accusations. Alleged mystic, I should say. Made some very serious accusations against a priest. And the cops got involved, and I spoke with one of these cops, a detective on the case, and he ended up listening to the witnesses and the claimant, the plaintiffs basically, and he realized something wasn't right. So he looked into their background. He found that they had this particular alleged mystic in common. And he, in fact, spoke to her. It was a woman. Spoke to this alleged mystic, and this person later said to me, "There was just something evil about her, Kevin. I can't explain. There was just something evil about her." Mm-hmm. And I said to him, "Yes, let me tell you why." And I proceeded to tell him and give him some written materials that I had written. And he got through some of the material, and he wrote me an email later that day, and he said, "I'm only on this part. I can't put it down." And I said, "Yeah, see, now you know why." But this person otherwise gives talks and everybody's like, "Oh, there was I could feel the Holy Spirit in the room, blah, blah, blah." And I'm like, you do realize that this person is trying to speak in front of large audiences, right? So it's,
wow.
Where's the hell? Where's the human? Where's the heaven aspect? I call it the 3 H's, heaven, hell, and human. Like I said, I won't mention names because I don't want to get sued. And I'm sure neither do you guys. But you have to be very, very careful, very, very discerning. And sometimes that requires digging into people's backgrounds. And with the advent of the internet, it's a little bit easier now to do these things.
And we can also trust. We can trust in the church as well, right? So God gave us this definitive revelation. Mm-hmm. He gave us the gospel, right? Mm-hmm. So I think we can use that. Like you said, Kevin, like the revelations that may be plausible, right? Maybe we don't want to rush into accepting this, right? Do they at least point back, right? Rather than point somewhere else. I think that's maybe just a way to perhaps simplify this a little bit. Do they point back? Yes. Do they reaffirm these essential truths that were given to us by God, by Christ. Or maybe do they, and you're right, because some of it, and my wife is very interested in this, because before she was Catholic, she would read a lot of these sort of new agey mystical books, right? So now she sees this in a very different lens. They might start with some things that are very superficially attractive, that seem very true, and then they're just subtly subversive. They're subtly subversive.
I like that expression.
And that's what you have to watch out for. Anyway, this could be a whole conversation on its own. This is really fascinating to me. Eric, I'm not sure if you want to jump in on any of this, but I do want to get to Fatima specifically. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And so this is actually really relevant to me, Kevin, because I was in a conversation the other day with a friend, and we were actually talking about Our Lady of Fatima, and he was just questioning, like, well, how do we know it's not demonic? How do we know that miracle wasn't just some demonic thing that happened? And so I would be so curious once we dive into Fatima to get your thoughts on that. But I think it'd be worth just sharing the story first and kind of going over it before we even tackle that. But this is a good, I think, way to view the conversation already, that we aren't just gullible. We're not just diving into something that doesn't have good evidence and doesn't have good church backing as well.
Yeah, good stuff. Yeah, Kevin, please take us.
Sure.
Take us into the journey. Sure.
Well, that's where to begin. If I was making a video of this presentation, I would have Google Maps up, or Google Earth, and I'd be zooming in on Fatima, Portugal, with the camera lens and the kind of recording. But Fatima is a place where the Virgin Mary appeared for really seven if you count the one a few years later, for six, but in 1917 for six primary apparitions or appearances, if you will. 3 seers or 3 visionaries. They were very young at the time, 10, 8, and 7, or somewhere into there. Drawing a blank now. Their names were Lucia dos Santos, Francisco, and Jacinta Maroto. And you'll notice I have the slight accent there. I can't help it. I've been working with Portuguese for a little bit. I'm not the best at it. I'm learning. But so I apologize if that's off-putting to anybody. But
all good
with the accent there. But and they were cousins. They were both cousins. Lucia had her family, and then Francisco and Jacinta were brothers, and brother and sister, and then they were cousins to Lucia, and of course, her to them. Mm-hmm. Let's see, they were shepherd children. I mean, they were just out in the fields tending their flock, and then all of a sudden they saw this flash of light, like lightning. They described it, and this was in May 13th, 1917. And then they saw this beautiful lady standing upon an azinera. In English, you call it a little holm oak tree. And my earbud keeps popping out here. Our Lady appeared and said that, basically in so many words, that God, Jesus had chosen these children to hear a message that was meant not only for themselves, but also for the church and the world. She asked them to come for 6 months in succession from May until October. And she would continue speaking with them and talking and communicating information. The most often pointed to particular apparition happened on July 13th, 1917. That is when Our Lady communicated information that is known popularly as the Secret of Fatima. And it was one secret that had 3 parts. And word had spread that this information had been communicated to the children, and which ultimately, in part at least, led to their being arrested by the local authorities, one of whom at least was a Freemason, Arturo dos Santos. I don't think he was related to Sister Lucia, though. Lucia later became a nun, so I call her Sister Lucia by default. Mm-hmm. They were late to the August 13th apparition, but Our Lady did appear to them in a local in Aljustro about 6 or so days later, on the 19th of August, or around that date. She told them to continue going to the place where the little tree was, called the Cova de Ira, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And she also had promised that a miracle would be given in October that would confirm what she was saying, or what confirm these appearances, what the information, the message that she was communicating to the children. And that message was primarily about how man was turning very much away from God, and he wanted to instill devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary as a way to call man back to himself. And I love the way Pope Benedict XVI, now Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, talked about it when he went to Fatima in 2010. He spoke about Our Lady in her role as prophetess, and coming to and speaking about God and drawing us back to him. Very beautiful imagery when you read that beautiful homily that he gave. I highly encourage people to read it. It's on the Vatican's website. And so the promise, October came and word had spread that there was going to be this miracle that was going to happen. Little known fact, or little appreciated fact, is that because the children were not there for the August 13th apparition, there was a consequence for that. Heaven actually mitigated the miracle. It was going to be even greater than what it was, but because the children had been abducted, that was the consequence. I'm reluctant to say punishment. I don't know, that's kind of a strong word, and I don't know if that applies here, but it certainly was a consequence of it.
Interesting. Mm-hmm.
And if I remember my facts correctly, we actually know just how it was mitigated. I'll get to that in a moment. So what happens is October 13th comes. The rain is pouring. The sky is, absolutely filled with clouds, and 70,000 people there in the Cova. Some estimates at 100,000, but the general accepted one is 70,000.
I just want to emphasize that 70,000 people.
Yep,
70,000. Okay,
and a lot of them were like secular journalists and atheists that were out to like disprove this thing, right?
Yeah, not all of them, but a good chunk of them. But there was a good number of them. Yes, some people were like Alvelino de Almeida, I think, was one of them. He was a writer for O Seculo or one of the other publications.
Right, and you can find their original write-ups where they. Well, I'll let you do it. Where they essentially admit, I can't explain this.
Yeah, I mean they are available in English, but the Sanctuary of Fatima, and I have them over here on my shelf. Maybe sooner I can turn the laptop here and show you about the library. But they started publishing a whole critical documentation series that's like 15 volumes long right now. I only have the first 5 or 6, but they have a lot of that documentation, so we now have it and stuff. And some translations are floating around, but I think we need to update them, especially now that we have this beautiful documentation. And De Almeida's testimony is in one of them, his article. So what happens is these people are absolutely drenched. The ground is soaked. Everything is there. And Our Lady appeared at her usual time between 12 and 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And she communicates further information, speaks to them a little bit more. And then just as she is starting to ascend back to heaven, Lucia, still in her vision mode, as it were, her ecstasy, said, "Look at the sun." And everybody looks over and sees all the clouds have parted, and they can see the sun. They can look at it full on without it burning their retinas. And some people described it as like a little silver disc was in front of it. And some people have said it looked like almost like or they made an analogy, saying, well, if it was a little silver disc, what if it was like a host, like the Eucharist? I don't know about that, but it might work. So what happens then is the sun starts to, as some people describe it, dance in the sky. It started rotating around, and there was basically this fantastic light show, essentially, and it was actually moving. And then it started coming closer and closer and closer and closer to the earth, and people were screaming in terror, and people confessing their sins openly. It was just, it was a madhouse. And then all of a sudden, the sun went back to its normal position in the sky, and people looked down, the ground, their clothes, dry. And that was actually one of the real powerful aspects of the miracle of the sun, because people could sit there and say collectives, hypnosis or suggestion, how do you explain the ground being dry? 70,000 people all saying the same thing, all unanimous.
Right.
That's not suggestion. That's not hypnosis. That's not mind control or psychosis.
Right. So there's I guess there's two aspects here. Is that I think a lot of people, and many people who affirm the miracle, would maybe not go so far to say as the sun itself was actually dancing, because then why didn't everyone else on Earth see it? Right. Rather, there was a mass vision. I don't think we would say hallucination. A mass vision is part of this miracle, but there was a real physical effect as well, a real physical miracle, which was itself the instant, what seems like an instantaneous change of the conditions, the weather conditions and the drying. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, but I would add that even the miracle of the sun proper, like the actual moving of the sun, was witnessed several miles away. So it wasn't even just in Fatima. So people that weren't even in the COVID area at the time actually saw it.
Well, that's interesting. So I guess again, I'm too ignorant on the issue to say either way. But it seems to me like it wouldn't undermine the miracle to say it was a mass vision, right? That still would seem to me to be perfectly acceptable as just saying that this is a vision rather than the sun literally dancing around itself.
Yes.
I don't know. I need to think more about that. I'm curious.
I believe that there's certainly a supernatural explanation for it. We can put it in terms of a vision. That's for sure. It's well possible to speculate upon it theologically. I know that there are some people, Dr. Stanley, I don't know how you say that. Is that the Jackie or Yaki? He was Hungarian, and he had a couple of books that were published that are available in English. I have them over here. And then there were some works over in Portugal. May I be blessed if I can remember their names. And there's a gentleman, actually, if I may mention it, his name is Bernard or Bernardo Mata over there in Portugal. He's about an hour away from Fatima. He's written a book on the topic in which he builds upon some of those Portuguese writers as well as Father Stanley's works. And it's trying to explain the miracle of the sun from a scientific perspective.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd love to read some of that because I think it's always good, right? Like as Catholics, like you said before, we shouldn't just accept things willy-nilly. We should try to apply objections and try to see, okay, is this legitimate? And so that's one of the things that initially came into, and I admit I didn't pursue this very far and read, some of the responses to it. But what I would say is, okay, even if we say it's a mass vision, it still seems like there's a supernatural act required to bring about that mass where everybody collectively is experiencing the same vision. Because hallucinations, from what we know, are very private things. Like if I'm hallucinating something, right, and Kevin's hallucinating the same thing, that isn't how hallucinations work. Kevin would be like, yo, dude, you're seeing things that aren't there, that aren't going on. So the fact that, right. So the fact that it's 70,000 people all having the same vision shows, okay, this isn't like within the realm of hallucinations. This is something very special in and of itself that seems like is pointing toward a supernatural act. And then when you layer on the fact of that additional miracle, we would say, of the ground suddenly being dry, now it seems pretty hard to explain, right? It seems really hard to explain if we're just trying to reduce it to the natural realm.
Yes, and there were some variances as to what people saw. And some people, in fact, didn't see anything. That's in some of the written testimonies, in fact. But at the same time, it might have been a consequence. Remember I mentioned earlier about the mitigation of the miracle. Mm-hmm. The children, the three visionaries, saw something very different than what everybody else saw. They saw visions of St. Joseph, the child Jesus, and Our Lady, and that's what Sister Lucia was pointing towards. She didn't see the sun dancing, she said later on. She said, I didn't see any of that. I was pointing to these people I was seeing in the sky. Everybody else saw the miracle of the sun. But what happened was that was the mitigation. Everybody would have seen those apparitions of Our Lady and St. Joseph and the child Jesus. That was the mitigation, was that only the three children could see that, not everybody else.
That's interesting that God... that has me thinking now in the sense that, okay, there's still a veridical nature to this, and the fact that the vast majority of people are all having either a very similar experience or the same experience, many of them, right? But maybe some people, for whatever reason, got less of that experience than others. Is that kind of what you're saying?
According to the testimonies, yes. I mean, there's no getting around that. And these are from Portuguese sources that are at least one of them is available in English.
So, we say there's the solid conservative estimates is there's around 70,000 people there. Would you say that it was the majority of those people that witnessed this?
Oh yes, there's no question about that.
Okay, yeah. So it wasn't like just 10% of them saw this. It was
there was an overwhelming majority. And like I said, I know Bernard Mata, I can't remember his name. I'm sorry. He wrote a book about it, in which he collected just even 150 testimonies, I think, of people of the witnesses. And then in the 50s or 60s, there appeared a book called Meet the Witnesses by John Haffer, in which he interviewed a few of them. One of them was a gentleman, Dos Reis, who had witnessed it as well, and he there are pictures of him in the book. So there are witnesses and testimonies.
And then as for the ground suddenly being dry, this is something obviously that everybody there experienced.
Yes, I know of nobody who ever disputed that.
Fascinating, absolutely.
Yeah, so it's kind of like there's layers. Like everyone agrees on the ground being dry. Then some people experience a more intense vision of the sun, and then the three children experience the apparitions, and that's kind of the levels, I guess you could say, of what happened.
Yeah, I never quite thought about it that way, but I like the way you leveled that. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so
cool. So you know what I'm curious about? Yeah.
No, go ahead, Eric. Yep.
I'm just curious about the actual substance of the messages. Because the miracle is great, and we can keep talking about that, and that is amazing. But what was the point of it? Is to point to the authenticity of these messages, right? Right. And what that secret was. I'm so curious to unpack that as well.
Yeah, that's an important point, right? The miracle is just a confirmatory sign to help us see, like, okay, we have good reason to think that we should take these messages seriously. So yeah, that's right. We shouldn't obsess too much about the miracle. We should look at it and be like, okay, this seems legit. Now, what is this pointing at, right? What are we supposed to take seriously?
Yeah. The message is that returning to God, the God exists. Remember, this is in the midst of atheism rising. And people, turning away from God, falling away from God, especially through the efforts of like the free thinkers, the Masons, Freemasons. That is, they really were and are. I'm going to say that out loud. A threat, and so we have to be very, very careful with these things. And there's a difference between American Freemasonry and European Freemasonry, and right. Dealing with Fatima, we're talking about European Freemasonry by and large. So the message is about return to God, and God offering us His mother as a way of turning back. She says that my Immaculate Heart will be your refuge and the pathway that will lead you to God. And so, even though that was spoken to the children, it's for all of us. Kind of like Jesus on the cross, He says to St. John, "Behold your mother, woman, behold your son, son, behold your mother." That's, they mystically represent all of us, St. John at least.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. When somebody first explained the deeper significance of that, it was so beautiful because it's also the order that matters. Like, woman, behold your son, right? The mom sees her children first. The mom is already there for all of us, right? Before we realize it, already there, loving us, caring for us, praying for us, and then son, behold your mother. We come to realize that. And I just like that described my life of coming to my own devotion and realization of the Heavenly Mother that was always there for me all along, always praying for me. That's something I always return to that brings me great joy.
Yep. And so it's the same way, in manner of speaking, with Fatima. God sends us His mother, and He gives her to us in this sense of that devotion to the Immaculate Heart, because if we follow her path, she is, as St. Louis de Montfort says, the mold of God. She literally bore the eternal Son of God. There's a prayer in the Eastern Church called the Akathist. And when you pray that, it's almost like a litany of different titles of Our Lady, like hail, O wound ever hurting to the demons, hail, O wonder ever thrilling to the angels. When you sit and you reflect upon that, you're like, wow, that's like, it's totally biblical, but you don't think about it that way. Because sometimes we can be literalists. If the Bible doesn't say it word for word, we don't get it. But yet there's a mystical element there. If we're not careful, we'll miss it. And the Akathist beautifully draws this out. And so when we think about it in these terms of the spiritual and devotional tradition, I'll call it, we see this coming out at Fatima, and she leads us. And Louis de Montfort's expression of the mold of God, she molds us into the person of her son, And so that's why Marian consecration is very important, coupled to the Fatima. And it's just absolutely fascinating. And so the message is that returning to God, prayer, penance, making reparation. There was also apparitions of the angel of peace, the angel of Portugal, which these prayers were encouraged with the children, which they said throughout the rest of their lives. Which I should add, both children, both of the Marato children they went to God by February 1920. Sister Lucia went on to live until February 13th, 2005. I remember when she died. I was in college at the time, and I remember when I heard the news. I woke up in my room and I was like, "Dad!" I was like, "Sister Lucia died." What? All of a sudden he snapped out of a dead sleep. And I remember remarking. I said to my roommates, "Now that she's gone, we're only going to really appreciate Fatima, like really get to understand it." And I said that back then because she was sitting, Sister Lucia, on so many documents, and when she died, that was going to pass into history, and we've only just crossed the threshold of that. There's so much more. I know for a fact that she left behind about 11,000 letters, and we only possess a fraction of them, and they're sporadic through different books. And with her being she's in the process of being towards sainthood, so it'll be a while before any of those things get published just yet, which is unfortunate.
Right. So yeah. Okay. So what are the main? There were also prophecies attached to Fatima as well, right? It wasn't just pointing back towards the essential truths of the gospel, which again is one of those things we look for whenever any type of claimed revelation, private revelation happens. What are these prophecies, and have any of them come true?
Every single one of them. The prophecies that primarily gets into the secret of Fatima that was communicated July 13th, as I mentioned earlier, 1917. And it kind of remains a fixation for people, the secret of Fatima, because the secret, I want to know. It kind of arouses our curiosity. And basically what the secret was a 3-part vision. The first part was a vision of hell. The second part were words of Our Lady in which she said, "You have seen hell where the souls of poor sinners go. To save them, God wishes to establish in the world devotion to my Immaculate Heart." And then she proceeds to talk about what would happen if this devotion was instilled and certain things were done. She also requested the consecration of Russia because she said that Russia would spread her errors if that country was not consecrated to her Immaculate Heart. Russia was not consecrated in time, and so atheistic communism spread throughout the world. Let's see, she also promised that in Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved. And then there was a very famous etc. that Sister Lucia had written down later in the 1940s after that phrase about Portugal and the dogma of the faith. And that was the beginning of the third part of the secret, which remained under lock and key until the year 2000 when Pope St. John Paul II decided to publish it. But because it was unpublished for so many years, all kinds of speculations happened. And there's no real nice way to say this, but people just took it too far. And there's still a lot of arguments over the third part of the secret. But when it was published in the year 2000, it was a description of the vision, of a vision that the 3 children had seen after Our Lady had communicated the second part of the secret. And it showed the Pope, bishops, cardinals, laity, all people from all walks of life going up towards this cross, and they're being shot at and killed, and angels are collecting the blood and sprinkling it over those who were still on their way up to this cross. And for many years now, and now 20 years, there's been a lot of ink spilled over what does this text mean. And so a few years ago, I decided to do that, to kind of take up these sorts of questions. And I wrote a book called On the Third Part of the Secret of Fatima, which gets into these very issues. I don't know if you want to, go into specifics, but that's kind of the overall projection of it.
How important, so I guess this is, for people who are hearing this for the first time, they've ever heard of the miracle of the sun, what is it that they need to know? What's the essential point of this? And I think this is another saying of when we look at private revelation is, what are the fruits of it, right? What are the fruits? Does it cause us to increase in love and charity and come back to God and come back to truth? Or does it cause us to kind of scatter about and become more isolated and egotistical? That's something my wife always remarked about some of the old stuff that she was reading, some of the new agey stuff. She said, the more I read this, the more egotistical I became, the more I felt how privileged I was to know all these things that nobody else did and how everybody else was wrong. And she says, looking back, I could really see the work of the devil there, whereas becoming Catholic, there's this great humility that's involved in it, in the fact that it isn't just about me, right? And it's submitting to, and this is a kind of difficult word for people at times, but it's submitting to a certain authority as well, and that requires a great degree of humility. But in my wife's reflection, I always found this very interesting. She found how that submission caused her to increase so much more in love and charity, and contrasting that with her previous kind of spiritual life, she's seen so much more fruit and goodness come about from that. And I always just find that very interesting. I come from a very different perspective, from a more just purely skeptical perspective. So I don't even know what I'm getting at with this, but well, yeah, that's right. So with Fatima, then, what is the essential takeaway for people who are just hearing this for the first time? Mm-hmm. And what type of implication do you think that's supposed to have in their lives?
I think Cardinal Ratzinger put it best in his commentary to the message of Fatima. He said that the criterion for these things is, does it lead you closer to Jesus Christ? Is there an increase in the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity? And you touched on that beautifully there in relaying the story of your wife. And that is what Fatima does. It is essentially the gospel, really, when you get right down to it. It's the gospel in an absolute nutshell. And my personal takeaway from it is, I like the way one writer put it. Fatima was an explosion of the supernatural into our world. And 103 years later, we're still picking up the pieces. And it's important because with all of this prevalent atheism, cultural Marxism, the rise, and I'm going to say this, democratic socialism, which is just communism and socialism warmed over,
right?
Was rehashed. Same error, just different people, different times. Mm-hmm. It's a reminder that no. There is an order. God is here. Things are founded upon that. So when Our Lady predicted, for instance, the Second World War, there's some symbolism in the miracle of the sun. What ended the war in the Pacific Front? Hiroshima and Nagasaki with the atom bomb, right? With the atomic bomb. Well, we talk about wanting to have the power of the sun, nuclear fusion, and all these other things, and yet look what happened in Fatima with the miracle of the sun. God actually says, no, you all may think that you have all the control over the elements, but no. Let me show you. It's not one-upping, but it's just almost like a reminder in a sense of no, I'm still God and I still control these things, not you.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Now that's my personal symbolism. I'm not saying that that's the official interpretation or anything, but I've always found that aspect, that way to look at the miracle of the sun to be very, very fascinating. Is that even though mankind was going to be rising up in pride, building our new Tower of Babel, God kind of says, nope, let me show you who's boss.
Yeah. So Eric, I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on this too, especially that point you originally brought up. By the way, since I'm in Wisconsin, I think it's worth noting that I'm in the only state in the United States that has an approved Marian apparition site up by Green Bay.
Really?
Yeah, that's right. Yep. Yeah, beautiful. I just went up there for the first time over the summer. It's incredible. Anyway, that's a whole different conversation, of course. But I just of all places, Wisconsin, right? Northern Wisconsin.
Real quick, what is it called? Our Lady of
Good Help.
Our Lady of Good Help. That's right. Yep.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Yeah,
and that's an immensely interesting story. But let's keep it focused on this. So yeah, Eric, why don't you
Yeah, I mean, I actually recently watched a video on formed.org about Fatima just last week, and it just brought me to tears, and just the beauty of these things. And what was crazy to me is the predictions that actually did get fulfilled. The context of Fatima is that these visions are happening during World War I, when all hell's breaking loose. And she did say, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, but she did say that the war would end soon. And sure enough, the next year, 1918, it ended. But if they don't heed the message, a greater war will break out, which sure enough it did, World War II. And that there would be a sign in the sky with lights that would usher in that new war, World War II. And sure enough, right before Adolf Hitler invaded Poland, there was the Auroras Borealis that like burst in the scene in Europe, over Europe or something.
That's interesting.
And so there is that confirmation of like, that's exactly the war that she was talking about, because there was the sign right before World War II. And then the third secret also had to do with the Pope. And so St. John Paul II, and once again, please correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, but St. John Paul II got shot in 1981. It was an assassination attempt, and he survived, but he was supposed to die. But he attributed his being saved by by that attack from Mary's hand. It was like one hand pulled the trigger, the assassin's hand, and one hand, Mary's hand, guided the bullet, because it was really supposed to go right through, but somehow it like missed barely. And then
zigzag path, yeah.
Yeah, and so he immediately called when he was in the hospital, like, give me the third secret of Fatima. And he was like, oh my goodness, this was just fulfilled. I was supposed to die, but thanks be to God I didn't. And sure enough, 3 years later, he consecrated Russia to the Immaculate Heart. And then about 5 years later, communism fell, and it was peaceful, relatively.
Yes. I'm going to blow your mind right now, so I hope you don't mind. There are a lot of misperceptions about what the Vatican actually said on June 26, 2000, when they released the text of the third part of the secret to the world. A lot of people say that the Vatican said that the assassination attempt on John Paul's life was the fulfillment of the third part of the secret. That is not what the Vatican said.
Okay.
No. This was part of the original research that I did. What happened was there was a press conference that introduced the booklet, Il Messaggio di Fatima, the Message of Fatima, to the world. And there was two interventions from then Archbishop Tarcisio Bertone and Cardinal Ratzinger. And then there was a Q&A period afterwards. We had the interventions. They're available on the Vatican's website, but they never transcribed the Q&A. Well, guess who now has it available? I made it. A fellow Fatima researcher gave me a copy of the Q&A session. Well, actually, the whole press conference through DVD, and I was able to get it transcribed from the Italian and then translated into English, and it's now in the appendix to my book on the third part of the Secret of Fatima. Previously, that had not been made available by the Vatican. So now we can actually go back and look at what the Vatican actually said. And what they did not say that the assassination attempt was the fulfillment of it. It said that there was a much greater context. It said that the third part of the secret was about the whole history of these evils that would be spread, especially in the 20th century. And they indicated that the assassination attempt was the Italian word is the past participle of it's a culminated in this assassination attempt. Did not say fulfill.
Okay.
Did not say that. So now that we have the actual words, we can go back and say, no, this was a misperception. The news media completely misreported it. And a lot of people ran with that. And we still, to this day, suffer from very serious misconceptions and misperceptions based upon how the media didn't get it right. Much to my own.
The media didn't get something right, huh? I don't believe it, Kevin.
One of the articles that was published came from like the Washington Press or Washington Times or something. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, why don't you get the transcripts? That was like my biggest deal with writing my book was just go to the blasted sources. Don't depend upon these second things. Go to the blasted sources.
Right. So what Eric said isn't necessarily wrong, as it is just maybe just incomplete, right? That's part of the third secret, but it's not the fulfillment of it. Is that fair?
Okay. Yes. John Paul's assassination is certainly part of it. But an interesting thing was John Paul was actually warned. He was warned. Shortly after he took the throne of St. Peter, after he was elected to the papacy, he was warned. Pope Paul VI had instituted an internal audit, essentially, of the Roman Curia, kind of like what Pope Francis or Pope Benedict did recently, Pope Emeritus, I should say. And it was headed by then Bishop Edward Gagnon, And his secretary, I think, helped him to write it. Monsignor Vincent Foy, I think was his name. And it was presented shortly before Paul VI had died. But he was dead within 6 months, I think, after he got wind of it. John Paul I was elected, and Gagnon went to John Paul I, gave him the verbal rundown, and he was actually going to act on it. But then he died. And then John Paul II gets it and talks to Gagnon, and John Paul had different priorities at the time, early on in his pontificate. And Gagnon said to him, well, he told him that, Your Holiness, like there's an assassination attempt that's going to be that's in the works here. And John Paul II said, well, in so many words, we'll deal with that later, or something, because again, he had other priorities. And Gagnon looked at him and said, if they let you live that long, Your Holiness. Well, Gagnon was ticked off that nobody was taking him seriously, so he submitted his resignation to the Cardinal Secretary of State, and who I think was Cardinal Casseroli at the time, and he went off to preach missions on the Sacred Heart somewhere. John Paul I had the assassination attempt, May 13th, 1981, and it is said that the first words upon waking were not about getting the third part of the secret of Fatima. It was he got Jeevish to lean over, his Colonel Secretary, Stanislav Jeevish, and said very weakly, "Find Gagnon." Took him a good little while to find him. Nobody knew where he was. But they eventually found him, brought him back to Rome, and that's when they had their meeting, and John Paul started taking his pontificate in a little bit of a different direction. And we know this because Gagnon's driver and personal secretary is still alive, and he has told people this story publicly on record. So that's why we know that.
Interesting.
Wow.
He was actually the guy that delivered the resignation to Cardinal Casseroli.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And Casseroli was ticked. He's like, "Where's Gagnon?" He says, "You wait down in the car." He's like, "You go down there. You go bring him up here." and his name is Father Murr. Father Murr looked at Casseroli and said, "He seems pretty serious, but if you want to go down there and tell him yourself, and he was just like, I'm not going to do that." Well, then I guess here's the letter.
So did John Paul II also ask for the third secret in the hospital, or was that not? Is that not true?
He did ask for it. He received it in July of 81.
Okay. And do you think it's important that, sorry, Pat, just a quick question. Do you think it's important that we do view it as that was a culmination, that was part of the third secret, but not the fulfillment? Because, hey, Fatima is still relevant today. It's not all fulfilled. We still have to actually do these things and make reparation and all those things. Is that why that's so important?
Well, I mean, that's part of it, but also a year after the assassination attempt, Sister Lucia herself had written a private letter to the Holy Father, May 12th, I think, of that year, 82. And she wrote to him, she explained what the third part of the secret was about, at least in a nutshell. And she said, if we have not seen the fulfillment, or not yet seen the fulfillment of this part of the prophecy, we are going towards it with great strides, I think is how she put it.
Okay.
So even she read it that way. And this is the woman who knew what was going on. So.
Yeah.
And so there's different ways to look at it. There's some debate on that matter. But I think the way you're looking at it is definitely one way we could look at it for sure.
So,
safety.
As interesting as it is to, I don't want to say speculate, but to investigate what this third secret is in its entirety. I think you hinted at this before, Kevin. Sometimes people might miss the greater importance, right? So as we wrap up here, because I know I'm going to be respectful of your time, specifically in the lives of Catholics or anybody who's thinking about investigating more into this, I would highly encourage that. There's many great resources. Maybe we can finish up by recommending some of those. On the day-to-day basis, what is Mary asking us to do?
She's asking us to love God and love her Son. And, with a deep passion and devotion, and not to forget that there's a whole other world out there with the supernatural, and that we are meant for this. This is part of who we are, especially as baptized Catholics and Christians. Don't forget that there's a whole other side of life. There are eternal consequences for these things. And I'm going to throw a little bit of a zinger out there. I'm sorry, present company, but yes, it is eternal. A certain eternal place of fiery doom. There, I said it out loud. No apokatastasis here. There, I said it out loud. I'm not saying, but this is eternal. There are consequences for our actions, and we have to do now to prepare for eternity. And so Our Lady comes as that prophetess to reveal the will of God. That's what it means to be a prophet, to reveal the will of God in the present. It doesn't necessarily mean to foretell future events. That could be part of it, but it's primarily about revealing the will of God in the present, to give people
Right.
guidance at a particular time or moment in human history, as how Ratzinger puts it. So Our Lady is reminding us, calling us back to God, like the good mother that she is. And we have to heed that message, because if we don't, like she showed the children, this is where you go. This is because, if you don't love God, why would you want to be with him in heaven for all eternity? That would be hell for you.
Right.
So there are consequences. And so she calls us back and to help other people. That's the reparation aspect, but also sacrificing for sinners, helping others to get to heaven. She says, in order to save them, she's not talking about people in hell already. She's talking about helping to save people who are on their way to hell, and so it's incumbent upon us to make these sacrifices. And now we just entered the holy season of the Great Lent, of the Great Lenten fast. So this is a perfect time to do these things for people.
Yeah. Eric, final thoughts, and then maybe Kevin, you could give the listeners some reading recommendations or some further resources for those who want to go a little bit further.
Yeah, just one final thought from me is just I love the prayer of Our Lady of Fatima that gets prayed usually at the end of each decade of the Rosary. And it's, "Oh my Jesus, forgive us our sins, save us from the fires of hell, lead all souls to heaven, especially those most need thy mercy."
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's just a good practical way if you want to get into devotion to start incorporating that prayer. And it's a beautiful prayer. So that would be my recommendation. Yeah, I mean, it's really cool to think that heaven kind of just invaded and really brought us back to a core message of the gospel, the core of the gospel, really. And so that's a beautiful thing to contemplate as we go forward from this conversation.
Eric, where should people go here? Maybe this is the first time hearing it, or maybe, even as Catholics who want to dive a little bit deeper into some of these devotions, if you could just provide a few resources, that'd be great as we finish up.
Well, for me, I would say the video I saw on forum.org would be good, that Fatima video. But
I'm sorry, did I say Eric? I meant Kevin, but obviously Eric says, yeah. Guys, let me be very clear here. I am eliminating coffee for Lent. So if I seem like I am somehow very slow, there is a chemical reason for this. But no, Eric, your recommendations,
Kevin, I guess I'll
of course, it's appreciated as well, Eric. Now be quiet, let Kevin talk. So yeah, the Formed one, awesome. We'll link that in the show notes. But Kevin, what would you recommend?
Well, there are other books that I like. There was one by a gentleman named Johnston, The Great Sign, I think it's called. That's a good book to start with. There's also the Memoirs of Sister Lucia, Calls from the Message of Fatima. And then she later became a Carmelite nun in Coimbra, Portugal. And her religious sisters published a book about her about 6-7 years ago now called A Pathway into the Gaze of Mary. Came out in Portuguese, but it is available in English translation now. And so these are excellent resources to begin with. There's now a critical edition of the memoirs, writings of Sister Lucia, all 6 of them. It's only in Portuguese at this time, but that's also a beautiful series there. So these are just some ways that you can start. I particularly recommend Calls to the Message of Fatima. I really do. If you want to get started somewhere, read Sister Lucia for herself. And she herself wrote that book. And it's a beautiful introduction and explanation to the Message of Fatima.
Awesome. And then for you personally, your website, you've got a YouTube channel. Let the listeners know where they can get in contact.
Sure. It's www.kevinsymonds.com. That's my website where you can find more about me, my updated writings. I just did some stuff on Medjugorje recently, an Italian to English translation of the Verini report. So there you'll find that and other stuff, also linked to where the books are. So feel free to check me out on the internet. And
Thanks for joining us, Kevin. We'd love to have another conversation again soon.
Yes,
I would love it. Maybe we could talk more about the controversies in the third part of Secret Fatima or something.
That would be fun. All right, guys.
God's beloved? I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.